Hello and welcome to today's episode, presented for Digitales TV. Today we're taking a deep dive into a story, um, a story with some pretty big implications, way beyond just like the boardroom. We're talking about Honeywell, one of the last big U.S. industrial conglomerates. I mean, they're in aerospace, automation, you name it. And they just made this surprising decision to split into three different companies.
Yeah, it is surprising,
Right.
especially because it seemed like they were doing really well as a company. But this move actually it kind of reminds me of what we saw with like General Electric and Alcoa, right? Breaking up their businesses, these huge, massive businesses.
Yeah, it seems like a trend. So let's break it down a bit, this decision. We know they're dividing into three companies, right? Focused on aerospace technologies,
Yeah.
automation technologies,
Yeah.
and then advanced materials. I think that one was already kind of in the works.
Yeah.
But the other two, that's pretty big news.
It is. And it wasn't like just a natural evolution either. Like they had a little push from an activist investor, Elliott Investment Management, I think it was. They bought a bunch of the company's shares and basically said, hey, we think you could unlock a lot of value if you split up.
Okay, unlocking value. That's one of those phrases you always hear in the business world, right? But what does it actually mean for Honeywell and their shareholders?
Okay, so think of it like this. When you have this big conglomerate like Honeywell was, their stock price might be held back.
Yeah.
By how well their weaker divisions are doing. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So by separating
Right.
into independent companies, each one can like reach its full potential, and then the market can value them more accurately, which could lead to higher stock prices, more dividends for shareholders, maybe even stock buybacks.
Interesting. So basically letting each part of the business kind of stand on its own.
Exactly. Even Honeywell's CEO, Vimal Kapoor, said that the split lets each company have tailored growth strategies, which is really important. Like, for example, the automation company might focus on expanding into renewable energy.
Which is booming right now.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the aerospace company could go all in on like next-gen aircraft systems, strategies like that might not have been as feasible if they were all still under one giant company.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so let's talk about Charlotte. Honeywell moved their headquarters there back in 2019, right? Brought jobs and investment to the city. Now with this split, what could that mean for Charlotte's economy?
That's a big question. Could have a lot of different impacts. We know Honeywell Automation, they're keeping their headquarters in Charlotte.
Okay.
But what about the other two? Will they stay put? Or will they get lured away by incentives or something?
And what about Honeywell and the Fortune 500? I know Charlotte pays attention to that list.
Yeah, for sure.
Could this split affect their ranking?
Oh, definitely. It's possible that none of the three new companies will be big enough for the Fortune 500, on their own, which would be kind of a bummer for Charlotte.
Symbolically, at least.
Yeah. It all depends on how well each company does individually. It's a lot of unknowns right now. The city's definitely going to be watching closely.
Right. We can't forget about the people.
Yeah.
What happens to the 1,150 employees at the Charlotte headquarters?
Exactly.
Will there be job cuts, relocations, or maybe even new opportunities?
Yeah, you have to think about that. When Honeywell moved to Charlotte, they talked about the city being business and family friendly, and they got some pretty big incentives from local and state governments.
Oh.
Now the city's going to want to see if those investments paid off, even with this new development.
Yeah, it's definitely a lot of moving pieces. Could be good, could be bad. It'll be interesting to see what happens with Honeywell and how it all plays out for Charlotte.
Yeah, for sure. And, speaking of transitions, one of the articles we read mentioned that Honeywell's trying to, recreate some GE magic with this split, which kind of made me wonder, is that a good strategy? What happened when General Electric broke up? Well, GE's story is kind of a cautionary tale, but also maybe some lessons for Honeywell. You see, General Electric was like the ultimate American conglomerate back in the day. I mean, they had businesses in everything, light bulbs, jet engines, financial services, you name it.
Right.
But that structure, all those different businesses, eventually it became a problem.
So they were spread too thin.
Exactly. Managing such a diverse portfolio, it got really difficult, and their stock price took a hit. Investors were putting pressure on them to streamline, focus on their most profitable stuff.
So they started breaking it up.
Yep, they started selling off divisions, getting rid of things that weren't core to their business, like their appliance business. They even spun off their healthcare unit.
So basically creating smaller companies.
Yeah. More focused companies that could compete better in their own markets.
And did it work? Did they find that GE magic?
Well, it's kind of a mixed bag. Some people say, yeah, it unlocked value. and let the individual businesses do really well. But others point out that GE's stock still hasn't recovered to where it was before the breakup.
So it's not a guaranteed success.
Not at all. More like high risk, high reward.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So with Honeywell, it's definitely a gamble. Only time will tell if it pays off. They're basically betting that they'll create more value by breaking up than by staying together.
It makes you wonder, is this the end of the era of giant conglomerates?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's definitely a shift happening in how companies are thinking. Agility, specialization, those are the buzzwords now.
Right.
Companies have to adapt to these rapidly changing markets and technology.
So maybe we're seeing a kind of evolution.
Yeah, I mean,
where these huge conglomerates have to adapt, or they'll get left behind.
it's an interesting way to look at it. And for cities like Charlotte, this evolution, it means they have to adapt, too.
Right.
Diversify their economies, attract new businesses to replace the ones that might be shrinking or moving away.
Yeah, it really does.
Yeah.
Makes you think about, like, the bigger picture. You know, we talk about the global economy and all, but these decisions that companies make, they affect real people. In places like Charlotte.
Absolutely. Honeywell's story is a perfect example of that, how those decisions, they're connected to people's lives.
So for our listeners, maybe they're not Wall Street analysts or anything, but they're still trying to understand all this. What's the one thing they should take away from this story?
I think the most important thing is to realize that the business world, it's always changing.
Right.
What worked yesterday might not work tomorrow. And even giant companies like Honeywell, they have to adapt, sometimes in pretty big ways, to stay competitive.
Change is the only constant.
Exactly. And being aware of those changes, even if you're not in business yourself, can help you understand the bigger economic and social shifts that are happening around us.
That's a great point. So as we wrap up this deep dive into Honeywell splitting up, I'm left with one question. Will this actually work? Will it unlock value for Honeywell and its shareholders? Or will it create a bunch of new problems?
That is the question, isn't it? Honestly, I don't know. Only time will tell. But maybe the real takeaway here isn't about predicting the future. It's about understanding that we're in a time of huge transformation, and that understanding these changes is super important for navigating the world we live in.
Well said. Big thanks to our expert for taking us through this story.
Happy to be here.
And to our listeners. Thanks for joining us. Don't forget to subscribe to Digitales TV. For more updates, we'll catch you next time. Thanks for listening.